The room laughed at the rusty car, but only one man saw the love that had once driven it. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across the grand ballroom of the Hayes Foundation as collectors, investors, and business leaders gathered for the annual charity automobile auction. Every polished classic car reflected years of careful restoration, while quiet conversations mixed with the soft melody of a live jazz quartet. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and elegant hors d'oeuvres. At the back of the room, Ethan Carter adjusted the sleeves of his clean but inexpensive denim shirt beneath a worn brown work jacket. At 39 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding damaged automobiles one honest repair at a time inside his small neighborhood garage. He had not come expecting to buy a collector's car. He simply hoped to find affordable replacement parts for an old pickup truck that belonged to one of his loyal customers. Beside him stood his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, wearing a simple blue dress and carefully holding the auction catalog with both hands. Her eyes wandered across the magnificent automobiles displayed beneath bright spotlights. "Daddy," she whispered with excitement, "do people really spend that much money on one car?" Ethan smiled gently. "Some people collect engines. Other people collect memories. Neither one is wrong." Lily nodded thoughtfully before slipping her small hand into his. Across the ballroom, Victoria Hayes stepped onto the stage as confident applause echoed through the elegant hall. At 34 years old, the billionaire heiress carried herself with effortless confidence, dressed in a beautifully tailored ivory business suit that reflected both success and discipline. Since inheriting Hayes Automotive after her father's passing 2 years earlier, she had become one of the youngest business leaders in the country. Tonight's charity event honored his legacy by auctioning vehicles from his private collection, although one final automobile remained hidden beneath a gray cover near the side entrance. Victoria thanked the guests before announcing the final presentation of the evening. "Most of the cars tonight have found wonderful new homes," she said with a composed smile. "Unfortunately, there is one vehicle that even our restoration experts agreed was beyond saving." A few guests chuckled quietly. She motioned toward the covered shape, and 2 attendants slowly removed the cloth. Beneath it sat an old rust-covered coupe with faded paint, cracked headlights, flat tires, and years of neglect visible from every angle. Soft laughter spread through the audience. One businessman shook his head. "That belongs in a scrapyard." Another guest smiled sarcastically. "Even the rust looks tired." Victoria allowed the laughter to fade before looking toward the back of the ballroom. Her eyes settled on Ethan after recognizing him from local newspaper stories about the mechanic who repaired vehicles for struggling families at little or no profit. A playful smile crossed her face. "Mr. Carter," she called. Every guest turned to look at him. Ethan blinked in surprise but politely stepped forward with Lily beside him. Victoria folded her hands gracefully. "You spend your life bringing forgotten cars back to life. Tonight I would like to donate my late father's old rust bucket to you. Consider it my contribution to your garage." The audience erupted into amused laughter once again. Cameras flashed as several reporters captured the awkward moment. Lily looked down at the floor, embarrassed by the laughter surrounding her father. Ethan remained completely still. He looked carefully at the weathered automobile, then back at Victoria. Instead of showing frustration, he quietly smiled, placed one hand over his heart, and nodded with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said calmly. "Every gift deserves respect because someone once loved it enough to keep it." The ballroom gradually grew quieter. Ethan walked toward the rusted coupe, gently resting his hand on its worn fender as though greeting an old friend rather than a piece of forgotten metal. His eyes lingered on the faded scratches and weathered chrome, seeing not junk but years of untold memories. High above the stage lights, Victoria watched his quiet dignity replace every laugh in the room with an unexpected silence, and for reasons she could not yet explain, she suddenly found herself wondering whether the least valuable car her father had left behind might be hiding a story no one else had ever taken the time to see. The old coupe rattled softly behind Ethan Carter's pickup truck as he slowly drove away from the glittering hotel, leaving behind flashing cameras, polished marble floors, and the echo of laughter that still lingered in Lily's memory. The evening sky glowed with deep shades of orange and purple while downtown buildings reflected the last light of the setting sun. Neither father nor daughter spoke for several minutes. Ethan simply kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing into the rearview mirror where the weathered automobile followed faithfully on the trailer. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "Daddy, why were those people laughing at us?" Ethan smiled gently without taking his eyes off the road. "Sometimes people laugh because they only see what is on the outside." Lily looked toward the rusty coupe behind them. "Do you think it is really just junk?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Every machine has a story. Someone built it. Someone drove it. Someone cared enough to keep it for years. I never want to forget that." Lily quietly nodded, absorbing every word. By the time they reached Carter Restoration Garage, the stars had already begun appearing above the quiet neighborhood. The small brick building stood exactly as it always had, with its weathered wooden sign, faded American flag gently moving in the cool breeze, and warm yellow lights shining through the front windows. It was not an impressive place, but it had become a second home for dozens of families who trusted Ethan more than any expensive dealership. Ethan carefully backed the trailer inside before lowering the old coupe onto the concrete floor with patient precision. The garage became completely quiet except for the gentle ticking sound of cooling metal. Lily slowly walked around the car, running one finger lightly across the dusty hood. "Do you think Grandpa Hayes loved this car?" she asked. Ethan paused before answering. "If he kept it all these years instead of throwing it away, I think the answer is yes." He opened the driver's door with care. The old hinges groaned softly, releasing the familiar scent of aged leather, machine oil, and decades of forgotten memories. Most people would have smelled decay. Ethan smelled history. He reached for a clean microfiber cloth and began wiping years of dust from the dashboard one careful stroke at a time. Lily joined him with another cloth, carefully cleaning the passenger side without being asked. Neither of them hurried. Neither of them complained. The silence inside the garage felt peaceful, almost respectful, as though they were visitors inside someone else's treasured memory. Several minutes later Ethan uncovered the faded steering wheel. His fingers stopped for a brief moment when he noticed the craftsmanship beneath the rust. "That is unusual," he whispered. Lily looked up. "What is?" Ethan leaned closer. "The wood grain on this wheel. Someone spent a great deal of time making it by hand." He continued cleaning, revealing original chrome trim hidden beneath thick layers of oxidation. The dashboard layout looked unlike anything he had seen on ordinary production vehicles. Even the stitching across the worn leather seats displayed remarkable attention to detail. Ethan did not say anything more, but curiosity quietly replaced his earlier gratitude. Just then his longtime employee, Frank Dawson, entered through the side door carrying a toolbox. He stopped abruptly when he saw the coupe. "Where in the world did that thing come from?" Ethan smiled. "It was a gift." Frank laughed. "Some friend?" Ethan only shrugged. "Maybe." Frank circled the vehicle once before shaking his head. "I would sell it for scrap before the week is over." Ethan gently rested his hand on the faded hood once again. "Not until I understand why someone kept it for so many years." Across town, Victoria Hayes stood alone inside her father's private office overlooking the city skyline. Through the glass walls she could see thousands of lights stretching into the distance, yet her thoughts remained fixed on one image from the auction. She remembered Ethan thanking her without a trace of resentment and the way he had touched the rusted car with genuine respect instead of disappointment. Quietly she opened an old photograph of her father standing beside that very coupe many years earlier. For the first time since inheriting his estate, she found herself asking a question that had never seemed important before. Why had he refused to let anyone restore that forgotten automobile? The next morning, golden sunlight poured through the large front windows of Carter Restoration Garage, illuminating tiny particles of dust that floated peacefully above the concrete floor. Ethan Carter unlocked the shop before sunrise as he always did, believing that quiet mornings often revealed things busy afternoons overlooked. Lily sat at the small wooden desk in the office finishing her homework before school while soft country music played from an old radio resting beside the coffee maker. Ethan walked slowly toward the rust-covered coupe carrying nothing more than a flashlight, a notebook, and decades of experience. He had restored hundreds of damaged automobiles throughout his career, yet something about this forgotten vehicle continued pulling at his curiosity. He gently opened the driver's door again, taking care not to disturb anything inside. Instead of reaching for heavy tools, he simply observed. His eyes moved carefully across every detail. The dashboard proportions felt different. The instrument panel carried no manufacturer emblem. The handcrafted steering wheel displayed workmanship unlike anything found on ordinary production models. Even the stitching across the worn leather seats followed a unique pattern. Ethan quietly whispered to himself. Someone built this with extraordinary care. He knelt beside the front fender and brushed away another thin layer of oxidation with a soft cloth. Beneath the rust appeared a small engraved crest almost completely hidden by time. It was unfamiliar, not belonging to any major American automobile manufacturer he had ever worked on. Ethan copied the design into his notebook before moving beneath the car with a portable inspection light. The steel frame remained remarkably solid despite its neglected appearance. As his flashlight traveled along the chassis, it stopped on an unusual serial number stamped much deeper than standard factory markings. Ethan carefully cleaned the surface until every character became visible. He read the number twice. It did not match any production format he recognized. He slowly wrote it into his notebook without saying a word. At that moment Frank Dawson walked into the garage carrying fresh coffee. "You are still studying that old pile of rust?" Ethan smiled without looking up. "The more I look, the less ordinary it becomes." Frank laughed. "You have said that about 3 different trucks this year." Ethan slid out from beneath the coupe and handed him the notebook. "Tell me if you have ever seen a serial number like that." Frank adjusted his glasses before studying the page. His smile disappeared. "No. That is different." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly." Lily skipped over carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate before peeking inside the old car once again. "Daddy, look." She pointed toward the passenger floor where a loose edge of faded carpet had curled upward with age. Ethan gently lifted the corner and discovered a tiny brass ring nearly hidden beneath decades of dust. He carefully pulled it upward. A narrow compartment quietly opened beneath the floorboard, revealing nothing more than an old iron key wrapped inside a piece of faded blue cloth. Lily's eyes widened with excitement. "It has a secret hiding place." Ethan picked up the key with great care. There were no labels, no markings, only years of gentle wear polished into the metal by countless hands. "Someone wanted this kept safe," he said quietly. Frank looked back toward the coupe with growing curiosity. "Maybe you should call a collector." Ethan slowly shook his head. "Not yet. First I want to understand the story before anyone starts talking about money." Across the city, Victoria Hayes sat inside her father's private library surrounded by shelves filled with engineering books, automotive sketches, and decades of carefully organized journals. She opened another leather notebook hoping to understand why he had refused every offer to sell the forgotten coupe. As she turned one yellowed page, a folded blueprint slipped quietly onto the desk. Across the top, written in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words that immediately stole her breath. Prototype 1. Never judge by appearance. Victoria stared at the blueprint in stunned silence, realizing the neglected automobile she had publicly dismissed might be the single greatest secret her father had ever protected. Victoria Hayes could not ignore the blueprint lying open across her father's old mahogany desk. The 6 handwritten words echoed through her thoughts long after sunset settled over the city. Prototype 1. Never judge by appearance. She slowly leaned back in the leather chair, remembering every conversation she had ever shared with her father about automobiles. He had often said that the finest engineering was rarely the loudest. True craftsmanship revealed itself only to those patient enough to look beneath the surface. Yet somehow she had forgotten that lesson during the charity auction. She closed the notebook carefully before reaching for her car keys. Across town, Carter Restoration Garage glowed warmly beneath rows of hanging work lights. Ethan Carter stood beside the old coupe, carefully removing years of dust from the engine compartment without replacing a single original part. He worked slowly, almost reverently, believing that restoration always began with understanding rather than changing. Lily sat nearby at a folding table coloring pictures while occasionally looking up to admire the mysterious automobile. "Daddy," she asked softly, "do you think the man who owned this car would be happy that you were taking care of it?" Ethan smiled without looking away from the engine bay. "I hope he would. Every family deserves to know someone respected what they left behind." Just then the garage door quietly rolled open. Ethan turned and was surprised to see Victoria standing just inside the entrance, dressed simply in blue jeans, a light cream sweater, and a navy jacket instead of the elegant business suit she had worn at the auction. Without the bright stage lights and expensive surroundings, she appeared less like a billionaire executive and more like a daughter carrying unanswered questions. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said gently. Ethan wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before smiling politely. "Not at all. You are always welcome." Victoria stepped closer to the coupe, expecting to find loose parts scattered everywhere or signs that someone had begun dismantling it. Instead, she found every removed screw carefully labeled inside small containers, chrome trim resting on clean cloths, and every original component arranged with remarkable care. Nothing had been thrown away. Nothing had been rushed. She slowly ran her fingers across the freshly cleaned dashboard, revealing more of the beautiful wood grain hidden beneath decades of neglect. "You have not replaced anything," she observed quietly. Ethan shook his head. "Not until I know what deserves to stay." Victoria looked at him with growing curiosity. Most collectors would already be planning how much money they could make. Ethan smiled gently. "Money is important. Memories are irreplaceable." Lily walked over carrying 2 bottles of cold lemonade from the office refrigerator. She offered one to Victoria with an innocent smile. "Daddy says people work better when they remember to take breaks." Victoria accepted the bottle, surprised by the little girl's kindness. "Thank you." Lily looked toward the old coupe. "I think your daddy must have really loved this car." Victoria lowered her eyes, quietly answering, "I think you may be right." Ethan carefully reached beneath the dashboard, gently brushing away another layer of dust. His fingers paused when he noticed a small brass plaque almost completely hidden behind an interior support bracket. After cleaning it carefully with a soft cloth, elegant engraved lettering slowly appeared beneath the grime. Neither Ethan nor Victoria recognized the symbol immediately, but both understood one thing. It had never belonged on an ordinary production vehicle. Victoria's heartbeat quickened. Ethan remained calm, studying every detail before speaking. "Whatever this car really is," he said softly, "someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure people would overlook it." Victoria stared at the hidden plaque, then back at Ethan, finally realizing the man she had publicly embarrassed was treating her father's final possession with more respect than she herself had shown, and for the first time since inheriting his fortune, she felt something far more valuable than pride quietly returning to her heart. The following Saturday morning, Carter Restoration Garage welcomed an unusual group of visitors. 3 respected automotive historians, accompanied by a senior appraiser from the National Classic Vehicle Registry, stepped through the open garage door carrying leather portfolios, measuring tools, and decades of combined experience. Ethan Carter greeted each of them with the same quiet courtesy he showed every customer who entered his shop. "Thank you for coming," he said warmly. "I only hope you can tell this car story better than I can." The oldest specialist, Robert Mitchell, smiled politely before walking toward the weathered coupe. "Sometimes the story tells itself." Victoria Hayes arrived only minutes later, carrying the original blueprint she had discovered in her father's library. She quietly handed it to Robert without saying a word. His eyes widened almost immediately as he compared the faded drawing with the automobile resting beneath the garage lights. "This cannot be," he whispered. The room fell silent. Ethan folded his arms calmly while Lily watched from the office doorway, sensing that something important was about to happen. Robert slowly knelt beside the coupe and carefully compared the hidden brass emblem, the unique chassis number, and the handcrafted steering wheel with several archival photographs stored inside his portfolio. Every passing minute made his expression more astonished. Finally he stood and removed his glasses before looking directly at Victoria. "Your father never told you?" Victoria slowly shook her head. "He only called it an old car." Robert took a long breath. "This is not simply an old car." Another specialist carefully examined the engine casting numbers before quietly adding, "Every major component appears to be original." A third expert inspected the handmade aluminum body panels and smiled in disbelief. These were never mass-produced. Ethan remained completely silent, allowing the experts to finish without interruption. Robert finally closed his portfolio and looked around the garage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with quiet reverence, "you are standing beside the only surviving prototype personally designed and hand-assembled by Richard Hayes before Hayes Automotive became a global company. Every production model that followed was inspired by this automobile." Victoria felt her knees weaken as she slowly reached for the nearest workbench to steady herself. She looked toward the faded coupe with completely different eyes than she had only a few days earlier. Robert continued carefully. "Its historical importance alone places its estimated value at approximately $7 million, possibly more depending on future museum interest." Frank Dawson accidentally dropped the wrench he had been holding. The sound echoed across the suddenly silent garage. Lily looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Daddy, does that mean the old car is really special?" Ethan smiled gently at his daughter. "It always was." No excitement appeared on his face. No celebration. No triumph. He simply rested one hand on the weathered hood exactly as he had on the night he accepted it. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "You knew something was unusual, but you never tried to sell it." Ethan quietly nodded. "I wanted to understand its history before anyone placed a price on it." Robert looked toward Ethan with open admiration. "Most people would have called an auction house the moment they suspected its value." Ethan answered calmly. "History deserves respect before profit." Just then television news alerts began appearing across mobile phones as one of the specialists uploaded his official preliminary report to the National Registry. Within minutes reporters, collectors, and museum representatives began calling Victoria's office, each hoping to secure the discovery that would soon become national headlines. Yet inside the little neighborhood garage, surrounded by warm sunlight, old tools, and quiet dignity, the $7 million valuation seemed strangely unimportant compared to the peaceful silence shared between one humble mechanic, one grateful daughter, and one billionaire heiress who had finally begun to understand the priceless lesson her late father had hidden beneath years of rust. The news spread across the country before sunset. Television stations interrupted their regular programming with headlines about the forgotten prototype discovered inside a small neighborhood garage. Automotive websites published photographs of the rust-covered coupe beside estimates that climbed beyond $7 million. Reporters gathered outside Carter Restoration Garage, their cameras pointed toward the quiet building where Ethan Carter continued working on an ordinary family sedan as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He believed every customer deserved the same attention, whether they owned a priceless collector's automobile or a 15-year-old commuter car. Lily peeked through the office window at the growing crowd. "Daddy, there are so many people outside." Ethan smiled gently while tightening the final bolt beneath the sedan's hood. "Then let us finish helping Mrs. Jenkins get home before we worry about anyone else." Lily nodded proudly. "Okay." Across town, Victoria Hayes sat inside the executive conference room at Hayes Automotive while attorneys, financial advisors, and board members debated the discovery with growing intensity. Greg Monroe, the longtime attorney overseeing the Hayes family estate, placed several legal documents across the polished table. "The prototype belongs to the Hayes estate," he declared confidently. "The transfer at the charity auction was made without knowledge of its actual value. We have strong legal grounds to recover it immediately." Several executives quietly agreed. Victoria remained silent, studying the blueprint her father had left behind. Finally she looked toward Greg. "Are you asking me to take back the gift?" Greg folded his hands. "I am asking you to protect your family's legacy." Victoria looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the distant skyline. Perhaps protecting his legacy means understanding why he let it go. Greg frowned. "With respect, $7 million changes everything." Victoria answered softly, "Maybe that is exactly what my father hoped to test." An hour later, Greg arrived at Carter Restoration Garage carrying a leather briefcase filled with legal paperwork. Reporters immediately surrounded him, expecting confrontation. Inside the garage, Ethan had just finished washing the grease from his hands when Greg introduced himself. "Mr. Carter, I represent the Hayes estate." Ethan offered a calm handshake. "Welcome." Greg opened his briefcase. "There are legal questions regarding ownership of the prototype." Ethan listened quietly without interruption. When Greg finished explaining the situation, silence settled over the garage. Frank Dawson looked worried. Lily gently held her father's hand. Victoria entered moments later, having driven directly from the corporate office. Before anyone else could speak, Ethan walked toward the old coupe and rested his hand on its weathered fender once again. He looked at Victoria with complete sincerity. "If this automobile truly belongs with your family, then you should take it back." Every reporter standing outside the open garage door fell completely silent. Greg stared at Ethan in disbelief. "You understand what you are saying? This vehicle is worth millions of dollars." Ethan nodded peacefully. "Its value has never changed my responsibility to do what is right." Victoria searched his face, expecting hesitation or disappointment. She found neither. There was only quiet dignity. Tears slowly gathered in her eyes as she realized that the one man with every reason to fight for the car was willingly placing integrity above fortune. Greg lowered the legal documents without another word. For the first time since entering the garage, he understood that he was no longer discussing ownership of an automobile. He was witnessing the character of a man who saw inheritance not as wealth to possess, but as a memory to honor. Victoria looked from Ethan to the rust-covered coupe and back again. In that peaceful silence, she understood something money had never been able to teach her. Her father's greatest masterpiece had never been the automobile resting before them. It had been creating the one test capable of revealing the kind of person truly worthy of receiving it. Victoria Hayes stood silently beside the weathered prototype long after the reporters had lowered their cameras. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the open garage door, painting long golden lines across the concrete floor where decades of honest work had left their quiet marks. Ethan Carter remained exactly where he had been moments earlier, one hand resting gently on the old fender, never once looking like a man who had just offered to surrender $7 million. Lily watched both adults with innocent curiosity, sensing that something important was happening even if she could not yet understand why. Greg Monroe slowly closed his leather briefcase. The legal documents that had seemed so important only minutes earlier now felt strangely meaningless. Victoria took a slow breath before speaking. "My father always believed that every great invention revealed something about the person standing beside it." She looked directly at Ethan. "Today it revealed something about me." Ethan smiled politely. "I think it revealed something about all of us." Victoria lowered her eyes before walking toward the driver's side of the old coupe. She gently brushed her fingertips across the faded paint, remembering childhood afternoons when her father disappeared into his private workshop for hours at a time. She had always assumed he was designing engines for the future. She now realized he had also been building lessons for a future he knew he might never see. "There is one more thing," she said quietly. "When I found the blueprint, there was also a note telling me to search beneath the driver's seat if the right person ever discovered the prototype." Ethan looked surprised. "We never removed the seat. I wanted to preserve everything exactly as it was." Together they carefully slid the old driver's seat forward. Beneath the original mounting bracket rested a narrow wooden compartment so perfectly hidden that even experienced collectors could have overlooked it for decades. Ethan carefully unlocked it with the small iron key Lily had discovered beneath the carpet. Inside rested a sealed envelope bearing only 3 handwritten words. "For my daughter." Victoria's hands trembled as she slowly opened the envelope. A neatly folded letter appeared inside, written in her father's familiar handwriting. She began reading quietly before emotion forced her to pause. Ethan respectfully looked away, giving her the privacy she deserved. After collecting herself, Victoria continued reading aloud. "If you are holding this letter, then someone has already seen the soul of this automobile before discovering its value. That person has passed the only test that truly mattered. Wealth attracts attention. Character earns trust. If this prototype reaches someone who treats it with dignity before learning what it is worth, then I ask you not to reclaim it. Instead, ask that person to help you protect the legacy behind it." Silence filled the garage once again. Even Greg lowered his head, deeply moved by the words of the man he had served for so many years. Victoria folded the letter carefully and looked toward Ethan with tears quietly shining in her blue eyes. "My father already made his decision." Ethan gently shook his head. "No. He trusted you to make yours." Victoria smiled through grateful tears. "Then I choose to honor both of you." Greg quietly removed every legal document from his briefcase before placing them into a paper shredder in the garage office without saying a single word. The sound of the paper disappearing echoed softly through the building, carrying away every remaining argument about ownership. Outside, the waiting reporters captured none of it. They never saw the letter. They never heard the final request. But inside the little neighborhood garage, beneath warm evening light and surrounded by old tools, one father's final lesson had quietly transformed strangers into partners, and the greatest treasure hidden inside the forgotten automobile had never been measured in dollars at all. The weeks that followed transformed Carter Restoration Garage into a place no one had imagined. Reporters eventually stopped waiting outside the building, collectors returned to their private museums, and the excitement surrounding the prototype slowly gave way to something far more meaningful. Every afternoon the garage once again echoed with the familiar sounds of ordinary repairs, friendly conversations, and neighbors dropping by simply to say hello. Ethan Carter preferred it that way. He often believed that the greatest blessings were the ones that quietly settled into everyday life. The priceless prototype remained exactly where it had always been, carefully covered beneath a soft protective cloth while Ethan and Victoria Hayes worked together every evening after business hours. Their goal was never to erase the automobile's age. Instead, they carefully preserved every scratch, every worn surface, and every handcrafted detail that reflected Richard Hayes's original vision. "Some scars belong in the story," Ethan often said while gently polishing the original chrome trim. Victoria would smile before answering, "Just like people." Lily loved sitting nearby with her homework, occasionally handing her father clean tools or reading aloud from books about American automotive history. The little garage gradually became a place where generations, professions, and backgrounds blended together without anyone noticing the differences. One evening, as warm sunset light filled the garage through the open doors, Victoria unfolded another page from her father's journal that had remained tucked inside the original blueprint case. She quietly read a passage that immediately captured everyone's attention. "A machine should never become a monument to wealth. It should become a bridge that helps someone else move forward." Silence settled over the garage. Ethan carefully placed his polishing cloth onto the workbench before looking toward Victoria. "Your father was still teaching us." Victoria slowly nodded. "I think he expected us to finish what he started." Over the following days they met with teachers, community leaders, and technical colleges across the state. Instead of discussing auctions or private sales, they spoke about opportunity. Victoria announced that Hayes Automotive would establish a permanent scholarship program for young men and women who dreamed of becoming skilled mechanics, restoration specialists, engineers, and automotive designers but lacked the financial resources to pursue those careers. Ethan agreed to oversee the hands-on apprenticeship program inside his own garage, mentoring students with the same patience he had shown every customer throughout his life. Greg Monroe volunteered to create the charitable foundation's legal structure without accepting a single dollar in professional fees. "This is the first contract I have ever wanted to write with my heart instead of my briefcase," he admitted with a humble smile. Months later, the restored prototype remained intentionally unsold despite increasingly astonishing offers from collectors around the world. Museums proposed record-breaking purchases. International buyers offered fortunes that would have changed countless lives overnight. Ethan listened politely to every proposal before quietly declining each one. "Some things become smaller the moment you place a price on them," he explained. Victoria completely agreed. One crisp autumn afternoon, the first class of scholarship students gathered inside Carter Restoration Garage wearing clean work shirts and hopeful smiles. Ethan welcomed every student personally before placing one simple hand tool into each of their hands. "Before you learn how to repair an automobile," he said calmly, "learn how to respect the person who depends on it." Victoria watched from the doorway beside Lily, realizing that the greatest inheritance her father had ever left behind was no longer resting beneath a protective cover in the center of the garage. It was alive in every young dream beginning to grow inside those walls, proving that true legacy was never measured by the value of a machine, but by the number of lives it quietly inspired to build something better. 1 year later, the first rays of spring sunlight poured through the enormous glass walls of the newly opened Hayes Carter Automotive Heritage Center, where visitors from across the country gathered to celebrate a legacy that had become far greater than anyone had imagined. Children walked through exhibits filled with engineering sketches, handcrafted tools, and photographs documenting the careful restoration of the famous prototype. Young apprentices wearing blue work shirts proudly guided guests through workshops where they were learning skills that would shape their futures. The building carried no feeling of luxury for its own sake. Instead, every hallway reflected humility, craftsmanship, and the belief that opportunity should always be shared. At the center of the museum rested the beautifully preserved prototype beneath soft natural lighting. Ethan Carter had insisted that the automobile should never be restored until it looked brand new. Every carefully protected scratch, every worn leather crease, and every subtle mark remained exactly where time had placed it, honoring the story rather than hiding it. A simple bronze plaque stood beside the vehicle. It did not mention $7 million. It did not celebrate records or auctions. It simply read, "True value belongs to those who recognize it before the world does." Visitors paused quietly before reading the words again, many leaving with thoughtful expressions instead of excited conversations. Victoria Hayes stood a short distance away, watching families admire the automobile that had once embarrassed her. She smiled as she noticed parents explaining to their children that kindness often uncovered treasures pride could never see. Ethan joined her carrying 2 cups of coffee, just as he had done countless mornings inside his little garage. "Busy day," he said with a gentle smile. Victoria accepted the cup. "Exactly the kind my father would have loved." Before either of them could continue, Lily hurried toward them wearing the same bright smile that had filled the garage from the beginning. At 9 years old, she proudly carried a folder containing letters from the newest scholarship students. "Daddy, they wanted you to read these." Ethan opened the first letter. A young apprentice thanked him for believing in someone who had almost given up on school. Another described repairing a family vehicle for the first time with confidence instead of fear. A third wrote that learning respect mattered even more than learning mechanics. Ethan quietly folded the letters and looked toward the busy workshop where dozens of students were laughing while learning together. "That is worth more than any automobile," he whispered. Victoria nodded, remembering the night she had stood on a brightly lit stage believing she was giving away nothing more than a rust-covered joke. She now understood that her father had entrusted her with one final lesson, one that could never have been learned inside a boardroom or measured on a financial report. Nearby, Greg Monroe welcomed new visitors with genuine warmth, having dedicated much of his own career to expanding the Scholarship Foundation. The man who had once spoken only through legal documents now spent his days helping young families find opportunities they never believed possible. As the afternoon sun filled the museum with warm golden light, a little boy stopped beside the prototype and looked up at Ethan. "Mister, why did you never sell the car?" Ethan smiled, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Because some gifts become more valuable every time they are shared." The boy smiled, seemingly satisfied with the answer, before running back toward his parents. Ethan stood beside Victoria and Lily as visitors continued walking peacefully through the exhibition. No one spoke about wealth anymore. No one cared about record prices or famous collectors. They remembered the father who hid wisdom beneath rust, the daughter who chose humility over pride, and the single father who quietly proved that dignity never needs applause to change the world. And as sunlight reflected softly across the weathered hood that had once inspired laughter, the room gradually fell into a peaceful silence, because everyone finally understood that the greatest fortune had never rested beneath the metal at all. It had always lived inside the hearts willing to see value where everyone else saw only rust.